Domestic gas prices are going through the roof. In Sydney and Melbourne, they've increased by around 50% in a year. At the same time as consumers are being hit, Australia is about to become the world's largest natural gas exporter. But that doesn't mean that the country will reap the financial rewards. As Madeline Morris explains, despite recent tax changes, we're still way behind the other large exporting countries in benefiting from our natural resources.
They dot our landscapes and our coastlines, massive gas plants that extract and process natural gas for export and use here in Australia. But are we, the owners of that gas, getting a good deal?
What we really should be worried about is A, to make sure we've got enough gas, and B, to make sure that Australians who own all that gas, the natural owners of the gas is the Australian community, that we get a fair return on that gas when it is extracted and sold. And there's been a big debate about that issue.
Next financial year, Australia will export about 70% of our gas, grossing $48 billion for gas companies. But very little of that will come back as tax because companies won't make much profit. That's for a couple of reasons. First, much of our gas lies offshore or underground in coal seams, so it's difficult and expensive to access. And historically, our tax regime has been very generous to the gas companies, letting them offset much of their building and exploration costs against tax.
What that meant was it was going to take a long time, many, many years, before these companies would pay any tax at all. Not surprisingly, many people would say, well, that's ridiculous. Why should we be allowing these companies to extract all this gas and export it, and we're not getting anything out of the result?
That's why the Treasurer's announced Australia is changing the petroleum resource rent tax, so companies now won't be able to offset as much of their development costs.
The tax itself won't change, it's 40% of profit, but the expectation based upon current projections of gas prices is to add about $6 billion over the next decade to Australian revenue, which is obviously a significant number, and I think squares up the ledger more effectively than we've seen in the past.
Next year, Australia is projected to overtake Qatar as the world's biggest exporter of gas. But over the next decade, the tiny country's government will net $26.6 billion from its gas projects, compared with our $6 billion.
Well, countries like Australia and the United States, the industry fundamentally is private sector, and the government's role is to put in place the appropriate regulatory structure and also impose taxes and royalties on the extraction and sale of that gas from our country. In countries like Qatar, where the government is effectively the gas company, whatever it takes is via a tax or resort rent or royalties is all one number.
As well as being state-owned, the gas industry in Qatar is also more established and their gas is easier to access. So Qatar will always keep more money from its gas exports than we will. Now, do we have enough gas to export and keep our homes and businesses running?
The evidence would seem to be now that there is enough gas in Australia for domestic and international purposes. The real debate is going to be around the price of that gas.
Gas prices have more than doubled in the past couple of years because our gas price is effectively pegged to the international one, which has gone through the roof. What's more, exploration restrictions and high exports have tightened supply and forced prices up, which is why we are now, incredibly, considering importing gas. The cost of importing gas works out at about the same as piping it from Queensland's coal seam gas fields down south. Now, some countries restrict gas exports, but our government's been reluctant to do that. And while restricting exports might increase available supply, it likely won't bring down those internationally pegged prices.
Debates around reservation policy, around gas pricing, is an enormous debate that's only opened up in the next 10 years. Several issues all get connected, and it's going to be some little while, I think, before governments and industry untangles these issues away.
Madeline Morris reporting.